My boss fired me simply for checking items that were supposed to be thrown away. He said, "You're not here to think. You're here to guard." After what I did later, he came asking me to give him a job. Let me tell you how this whole mess started. I was working as a night security guard at the Boston Museum of Contemporary Art. Now, I know what you're thinking. Typical millennial can't hold down a real job, right? Wrong. This was actually my dream gig while I was finishing my art history degree at UMass. The pay was decent. The hours were perfect for my class schedule, and I got to spend my nights surrounded by some of the most incredible art pieces you've ever seen. The museum had this old school vibe, you know? Marble floors that echoed every footstep, those fancy spotlights that made everything look like it belonged in a movie. I'd walk my rounds with this heavy flashlight and a clipboard, checking off boxes like some kind of art world security robot. But here's the thing, I actually loved it. While the rest of Boston was getting hammered at sports bars or binge-watching Netflix, I was alone with masterpieces worth millions. It was like having the world's most expensive private art gallery all to myself. My supervisor was this guy named Richard, mid-50s. Always wore these cheap suits that looked like he bought them at a strip mall. Real middle management type, you know? The kind of guy who peaked in high school and never got over it. He'd been working at the museum for like 15 years, started as a security guard himself, but now he acted like he was running the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Always walking around with his clipboard, making notes about everything, treating us guards like we were complete morons. The job was pretty straightforward. Walk the designated routes every hour, check all the doors and windows, make sure nobody was trying to pull some Ocean's 11 stuff. Most nights were dead quiet. I'd finish my rounds in about 45 minutes, then spend the rest of the time in the security office reading art books or browsing museum catalogs online. I was actually learning more about art history from this job than I was from half my classes. That's when I started noticing weird stuff happening in the basement storage area. You know how museums are. They've got like 10 times more art than they can actually display. So there's this whole underground maze of storage rooms, climate-controlled and everything, where they keep pieces that aren't currently on exhibition. Part of my route took me through there, and I'd always slow down to check out what was stored. One night in early March, I'm doing my usual basement sweep when I notice these cardboard boxes stacked near the loading dock. They're labeled disposal, authorized by R. Chun in that official museum font. Now, this wasn't unusual. Museums are constantly getting rid of old frames, damaged pieces, outdated promotional materials. But something about these boxes caught my attention. First off, they were really heavy. Like, suspiciously heavy for stuff that was supposedly junk. Second, they weren't sealed properly. Some of the tape was coming loose, and I could see bubble wrap and what looked like wooden frames inside. But here's the kicker. They'd been sitting there for almost 2 weeks. In my experience, disposal stuff usually got picked up within a few days. My curiosity got the better of me. I mean, I'm an art history major, right? I've been trained to notice details, to ask questions when something doesn't add up. These boxes were just sitting there for weeks, taking up space, and something about the whole situation felt off. The weight, the way they were packed, the fact that they hadn't been picked up yet. It all seemed weird. Being the responsible employee I figured I should mention it to Richard. Maybe there was some kind of mix-up with the disposal company. Maybe these boxes weren't supposed to be thrown away yet. I mean, what if there was valuable stuff in there that someone forgot about? It happens all the time in big institutions like this. The next morning, right when Richard got to work, I approached him about the boxes. I explained where they were located, how long they'd been sitting there, and asked if maybe someone should double-check them before they got hauled away. I thought I was being helpful, you know, like a good employee who cares about the museum's assets. Richard looked at me like I just asked him to solve quantum physics. He had this expression on his face, part annoyance, part confusion, like he couldn't understand why a security guard would even be thinking about disposal procedures. He set down his coffee and just stared at me for a few seconds. Then he said it. "You're not here to think. You're here to guard." He went on to explain, in this really condescending tone, that disposal items had already been reviewed by the proper authorities. He said my job was to walk my rounds, check doors, and write incident reports, not to question museum procedures. He made it clear that I was overstepping my bounds by even asking about the boxes. The whole conversation felt like being scolded by a high school principal. He talked to me like I was some kind of idiot who couldn't possibly understand how a real museum operates. Like my art history education meant nothing. Like my observations were worthless because I was just a part-time security guard. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to cause problems, that I was just looking out for the museum's interests. But he cut me off and said that if I had concerns about procedures, I should fill out a formal report and submit it through proper channels. Then he basically dismissed me and went back to his coffee. Walking away from that conversation, I felt completely deflated. Here I was, trying to be a good employee, and I got treated like I was some kind of troublemaker. The way Richard talked to me, you'd think I was suggesting we burn the place down instead of just double-checking some boxes. But you know what? His attitude really got under my skin. Maybe it was the way he dismissed my education, or how he acted like I was too stupid to have a valid concern. Either way, something about the whole interaction made me more curious about those boxes, not less. I started thinking about it during my rounds. What if there really was something valuable in there? What if Richard was wrong, and the museum was about to throw away something important? I mean, mistakes happen all the time. People are human. Even experts can overlook things. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Richard's reaction was actually pretty suspicious. If the boxes really contained nothing but junk, why was he so defensive about my question? Why wouldn't he just say something like, "Yeah, it's just old frames and catalogs, no big deal"? Instead, he got all weird about it. So I made a decision. If Richard wasn't going to take my concerns seriously, maybe I needed to investigate this myself. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? I'd take a peek inside some boxes that are headed for the trash anyway. It's not like I was planning to steal anything or cause damage. The next night, during my rounds, I decided to take a closer look at those disposal boxes. Just to satisfy my curiosity, you know? Just to prove to myself that Richard was right and I was being paranoid. I figured I'd take a quick peek, see a bunch of junk, and then forget about the whole thing. But as I stood there in that basement storage room, staring at those cardboard boxes, I had no idea that I was about to stumble onto something that would completely change my life. Something that would turn my boring security job into the most expensive mistake my boss ever made. Big mistake on my part, too, as it turned out. So there I was, standing in that basement storage room during my next shift, staring at those cardboard boxes like they held the secrets of the universe. Richard's dismissive attitude had only made me more curious. I mean, what kind of supervisor gets defensive about garbage? Unless it wasn't really garbage. I decided to take a quick peek, just to satisfy my curiosity, you know? I carefully opened the first box, trying not to disturb the tape too much. Inside were old picture frames, some museum catalogs from the 1980s, and a bunch of bubble wrap. Pretty much what you'd expect from disposal items. Nothing exciting. The second box was more of the same, outdated promotional materials. Some broken display stands, a few books that looked like they'd been through a flood. I was starting to think Richard was right, and I was just being paranoid. Maybe I'd been watching too many movies where security guards stumble onto conspiracies. But then I opened the third box. Right on top was this canvas wrapped in protective paper. It was unframed, maybe 24 by 18 inches. And when I carefully unwrapped it, I saw this abstract piece with these loose, gestural lines in black and red paint. At first glance, it looked like complete nonsense, just random marks and scribbles. But something about it made me stop. The brushwork, the way the paint was applied in these confident, flowing strokes. It reminded me of something I'd seen before. I just finished writing this massive research paper on post-war American abstract expressionism, and one of the artists I focused on was Cy Twombly. Now, I'm not claiming to be some art expert, but I'd spent months studying Twombly's work for my thesis. This piece had all the hallmarks of his early 1950s style, when he was still developing his signature approach to mark making. The technique, the color palette, even the way the canvas was stretched. Everything screamed Twombly. I took some photos with my phone, being super careful not to damage anything. Then I spent the rest of my shift researching Twombly's catalog online, trying to find any similar pieces. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just some random painting. This could be a lost work by one of America's most important abstract artists. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was practically vibrating with excitement. I potentially discovered a Twombly work that was about to be thrown in a dumpster. In the art world, this would be like finding a winning lottery ticket in your old jeans. But I knew I had to be careful about how I handled this. I went home, showered, and spent the morning doing more research. I compared the brushstrokes, the materials, the style with authenticated Twombly pieces from the same period. Everything matched. I even found some documentation about a series of works he created in 1954 that had gone missing after a gallery closure in the 1960s. This was it. This was the real deal. And my boss was about to throw it away because he couldn't be bothered to look twice at disposal items. I decided I had to try one more time to get through to Richard. Maybe if I presented the evidence properly, he'd understand what we were dealing with. The next day, I showed up to work early to catch Richard before his shift started. I brought printouts of my research, photos of the painting, and a whole presentation about why this piece might be significant. I thought if I approached it professionally, with evidence, he'd take me seriously. I found him in his office, eating another one of those gas station breakfast sandwiches. I knocked on his door frame and asked if I could speak with him about something important. He looked up at me with this annoyed expression, like I was interrupting something crucial instead of him scrolling through Facebook. I started explaining what I'd found, showed him the photos, walked him through the research I'd done. I pointed out the similarities to authenticated Twombly works, explained the historical context, and suggested that maybe we should get a second opinion before disposing of the piece. The whole time, Richard just stared at me with this increasingly irritated expression. When I finished my presentation, he set down his sandwich and leaned back in his chair. I could see the anger building in his face like a storm cloud. That's when he exploded. He started yelling about how I'd gone through disposal items without authorization, how I was overstepping my authority as a security guard, how I needed to stick to my job description. He said I was being insubordinate and that my opinion as a part-time college student didn't matter. Then he said something that really got under my skin. He told me that the disposal items had been reviewed by people with actual expertise, unlike me, and that my amateur art history knowledge was worthless. He said I was wasting his time with conspiracy theories and that I needed to focus on my actual job. But the worst part was when he looked me dead in the eye and said, "One more time you touch anything without permission and you're out of here." The way he said it, with a smug satisfaction, like he was enjoying putting me in my place, it made my blood boil. I tried to stay calm, tried to explain that I was just looking out for the museum's interests. But he cut me off and said that if I had concerns about procedures, I should fill out a formal report and submit it through proper channels. Then he told me to get back to work and stop bothering him with nonsense. Walking away from that conversation, I felt completely humiliated. Here I was, potentially saving the museum from making $1 million mistake, and I was being treated like some kind of troublemaker. The way Richard talked to me, you'd think I was trying to steal something instead of trying to help. But his attitude only made me more determined. If he wasn't going to listen to reason, maybe I needed to find another way to protect that painting. I mean, what if I was right? What if this really was a lost Twombly work? Could I just stand by and watch it get thrown away because my boss was too arrogant to admit he might be wrong? I decided to do some more research on my own time. I reached out to some professors from my art history program, posted some questions on art forums, even contacted a few galleries to see if anyone could help me verify what I'd found. I figured if I could get some outside expert opinion, Richard would have to take me seriously. For the next few days, I kept my head down at work, did my rounds, and didn't mention the painting to anyone, but I was constantly thinking about it. Every time I walked past those disposal boxes, I wondered if I was looking at a masterpiece that was about to become landfill. Then, about a week later, I got a response from one of the art forums I'd posted on. An expert from New York had looked at my photos and said the piece showed promising characteristics of Twombly's work from that period. She suggested I try to get a proper authentication done if possible. That's when I made my second mistake. I decided to approach Richard one more time, armed with this expert opinion. I thought maybe if he heard it from someone with actual credentials, He'd finally understand what we were dealing with. I was wrong, dead wrong, and that conversation would end up costing me my job. Because 2 days later, I was called into the HR office and told that my employment was being terminated for violation of security protocols. Apparently, going through disposal items without authorization was grounds for immediate dismissal. Richard had fired me. Just like that. No warnings, no second chances, no consideration for the fact that I might have been trying to help. He'd gotten rid of me because I dared to think, to question, to care about something more than just walking my rounds like a robot. But here's the thing. He thought getting rid of me would solve his problem. He thought that by firing me, he could go back to his comfortable little world where security guards don't ask questions and disposal items get thrown away without a second thought. He had no idea that I still had those photos on my phone, and he definitely had no idea what I was about to do with them. Getting fired should have been the end of the story. Most people would have just moved on, found another job, maybe grumbled about their idiot boss for a few weeks before forgetting the whole thing. But I couldn't let it go. Not when I knew there was potentially a masterpiece sitting in those disposal boxes, waiting to be thrown away. I still had the photos on my phone, and I still had that contact from the art forum, the expert from New York who'd said the piece showed promising characteristics. Her name was Dr. Sarah Martinez, and she specialized in mid-century American abstract expressionism. She'd given me her email and suggested I reach out if I want to pursue authentication. So that's exactly what I did. I sent her all my photos, along with detailed descriptions of the canvas, the brushwork, and the materials I'd observed. I also included everything I'd researched about Twombly's missing works from the 1950s. If anyone could tell me whether I was onto something or just seeing things, it would be her. Dr. Martinez responded within 24 hours, and her email made my heart race. She said the piece exhibited several key characteristics of Twombly's work from around 1954, the gestural line quality, the specific way he applied paint, even the type of canvas he typically used during that period. She couldn't make a definitive attribution from photos alone, but she was intrigued enough to suggest a physical examination. There was just one problem. I didn't have access to the painting anymore. I'd been fired, banned from the museum, and for all I knew, those disposal boxes had already been hauled away to a landfill. But I had to try something. I couldn't just sit there knowing I might have discovered a lost masterpiece. I decided to go back to the museum, not as an employee, but as a regular visitor. I figured I could at least check if the disposal boxes were still there, maybe talk to some of my former co-workers and see what the status was. It was a long shot, but I had to try. The museum was busy that afternoon. Typical weekend crowd of tourists and art students. I bought a ticket, like any other visitor, and tried to blend in. I knew the security protocols, knew how to avoid the cameras, knew which areas were less monitored. It felt weird being on the other side of the security system I'd once been part of. I managed to slip down to the basement storage area during a shift change. The disposal boxes were still there, sitting exactly where I'd left them. Apparently, the disposal company hadn't picked them up yet. I had a small window of opportunity. But I had to be smart about it. That's when I had what might have been either a brilliant idea or a completely insane one. Instead of trying to sneak the painting out or do anything that could get me arrested, I decided to try to buy the disposal items legitimately. I mean, if the museum was throwing them away anyway, why wouldn't they sell them to me? I went to the museum's administrative office and asked to speak with someone about purchasing disposal items. The receptionist looked at me like I'd asked to buy the Mona Lisa, but she eventually connected me with a junior administrator named Mike who handled surplus property sales. Mike was this young guy, probably fresh out of college, who seemed genuinely confused by my request. He explained that the museum did occasionally sell surplus items, but usually only to other institutions or established dealers. Private individuals didn't typically buy disposal materials. I told him I was an art history student working on research about museum practices, and that I was interested in studying how institutions handled deaccession materials. It was sort of true. I was studying the materials, just not for the reasons I was claiming. Mike seemed to buy my story, or at least he didn't see any harm in it. He said he'd need to check with his supervisor, but if the items were already designated for disposal, there probably wouldn't be any problem selling them. He quoted me a price of $75 for 3 boxes, basically just covering the administrative costs. $75. That's what the museum was willing to accept for boxes that potentially contained a multi-million-dollar artwork. I tried to keep my expression neutral as I agreed to price, but inside I was doing cartwheels. The paperwork took about a week to process. Mike called me on a Thursday afternoon and said I could pick up the boxes the following Monday. I spent that weekend researching everything I could about art authentication, trying to prepare for what might come next. Monday morning, I showed up at the museum's loading dock with my beat-up Honda Civic and $75 in cash. Mike met me there with the 3 boxes, had me sign some paperwork, and just like that, I was a proud owner of what the Boston Museum of Contemporary Art considered garbage. I drove straight to a storage unit I'd rented specifically for this purpose. I didn't want to risk damaging anything by keeping it in my apartment. I carefully opened each box again, cataloging everything inside. The Twombly piece was still there, wrapped in protective paper, looking exactly as I remembered it. Dr. Martinez had agreed to examine the piece in person if I could get it to her lab in New York. She worked with a team of specialists who could do everything from paint analysis to canvas dating. It would cost me about $3,000, money I didn't have, but I figured I could put on credit cards if the piece turned out to be authentic. The authentication process took almost 2 months. Dr. Martinez and her team analyzed the paint composition, studied the brushwork under magnification, even used X-ray imaging to examine the canvas underneath. They compared it to authenticated Twombly works from the same period, looking for matching characteristics in technique and materials. I'll never forget the phone call I got on a Tuesday morning in late May. Dr. Martinez called me personally to deliver the news. The piece was authentic, and in signed work by Cy Twombly, most likely created in 1954 during his time in Rome. It matched perfectly with descriptions of works from his Roman series that had been missing since the 1960s. She explained that the painting had probably been acquired by the museum decades ago as part of a larger donation, then misattributed or simply forgotten in storage. Without a signature or proper documentation, it had sat in the basement for years, eventually being marked for disposal when someone decided to clean out old inventory. The estimated value? Somewhere between $2.5 and $4 million, depending on market conditions and collector interest. Dr. Martinez said she'd never seen anything quite like it, a completely unknown work by a major artist, authenticated through pure chance and security guard's curiosity. I sat in my car after that phone call, just staring at my phone in disbelief. I'd gone from being a fired security guard to owning a multi-million-dollar artwork. It felt like I was living in some kind of fever dream. But then reality set in. I had a valuable painting, but I had no idea how to actually sell it. I needed to find a reputable gallery, get it properly insured, navigate the complex world of high-end art sales. And I had to do it all while keeping quiet about where the piece had come from. Dr. Martinez introduced me to a gallery owner in Chelsea who specialized in post-war American art. His name was David Chun, and he'd been dealing with museum-quality pieces for over 20 years. When I showed him the authentication documents, his eyes lit up like he'd just won the lottery. David explained that finding an unknown Twombly work was like discovering a new Beatles recording. It would cause sensation in the art world. He offered to handle the sale through his gallery, taking a 25% commission in exchange for managing everything from insurance to marketing to the actual auction. The plan was to consign the piece to Sotheby's for their fall contemporary art auction. David said that a work of this caliber, with proper marketing and documentation, could easily exceed the initial estimate. He was talking about numbers that made my head spin. 3.5 million, maybe 4 million, possibly even more if the right collectors got into a bidding war. As I sat in David's gallery, signing consignment agreements and insurance forms, I kept thinking about Richard back at the museum. He'd fired me for trying to prevent exactly this from happening. He'd thrown away what could have been the most valuable piece in the museum's collection, all because he couldn't admit that a part-time security guard might know something he didn't. The irony was almost too perfect. Richard had gotten rid of me to protect his authority, but in doing so, he'd handed me the biggest art discovery of my lifetime, and he had no idea what he'd lost. Not yet. Anyway, the months leading up to the Sotheby's auction were surreal. David Chun had thrown the full weight of his gallery behind promoting the piece, which was now officially cataloged as Untitled C. 1954 by Cy Twombly. The art world was buzzing about the discovery, a completely unknown work by one of America's most important abstract artists. Art magazines were calling it the find of the decade. The New York Times ran a feature story about lost masterpieces hiding in plain sight. David arranged for the painting to be displayed at his Chelsea gallery for 2 weeks before the auction, and the opening night was packed with collectors, critics, and curious art lovers. I stood in the corner of that gallery, watching people examine the painting I'd almost seen thrown away. These were serious collectors, the kind of people who owned multiple Picassos and thought nothing of spending millions on a single piece. And they were all fascinated by my little discovery. The pre-sale estimate was $2.8 to $3.5 million, but David was quietly telling potential bidders that it might go higher. He generated significant international interest, with collectors from Europe and Asia expressing serious intent to bid. There was even a rumor that a major museum was planning to participate. The auction was scheduled for the second week of October. I'd never been to a high-end art auction before, and the whole experience felt like stepping into a different world. Sotheby's auction house on the Upper East Side was this temple to wealth and culture, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers. David had arranged for me to have a front row seat to watch the bidding. I wore the only suit I owned, a cheap one I'd bought for job interviews, and tried not to look too out of place among the millionaires and billionaires in the room. The auctioneer was a smooth British guy who made selling multi-million-dollar art look as easy as ordering coffee. When Lot 47, my painting, came up, he gave this elegant description of the piece's history and significance. He didn't mention that it had been discovered in a museum's disposal boxes. Of course, that would have been bad for mystique. The bidding started at $2.5 million. Within 30 seconds, it had jumped to $3 million. I watched in amazement as paddle numbers flashed around the room. 127, 89, 203. These people were bidding hundreds of thousands of dollars like it was monopoly money. By the time the bidding reached $3.5 million, only 3 serious bidders remained. There was an elegant woman in the front row who kept raising her paddle with surgical precision. Behind her, a man in an expensive suit was bidding through phone calls to his representative. And in the back, someone was bidding through one of the auction house staff. The auctioneer's voice maintained its calm professionalism, but I could sense the excitement building in the room. This was turning into exactly the kind of bidding war that auction houses dream about. The price kept climbing. $3.8 million, $4.1 million, $4.3 million. When the bidding hit $4.5 million, the woman in the front row finally dropped out. She shook her head almost imperceptibly and lowered her paddle. That left the phone bidder and the mystery person in the back, going head-to-head for my painting. The final few minutes felt like they lasted forever. The bids were now increasing by $100,000 at a time. $4.6 million, $4.7 million, $4.8 million. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. This was more money than I'd ever imagined existing, let alone belonging to me. Finally, at $4.9 million, the phone bidder dropped out. The auctioneer looked toward the back of the room, where the mysterious final bidder was sitting. He waited a moment, then brought down his gavel with a satisfying crack. The final price was $4.9 million, plus the buyer's premium and fees, bringing the total to just over $5.4 million. After David's commission and various expenses, I was looking at a net payout of around $3.2 million. David found me in the hallway after the auction, grinning like he'd just won the Super Bowl. He told me the winning bidder was a private collector from Texas who specialized in post-war American art. The guy had been hunting for a Twombly piece for years and was thrilled to finally land one. We went out for drinks that night to celebrate. David kept saying it was the most exciting sale he'd been involved with in his 20-year career. He said the story would become legendary in the art world. The security guard who saved a masterpiece from the trash. But I wasn't thinking about legends. I was thinking about what I wanted to do with the money. I could have bought a house, invested it all, retired early and lived off the interest. Instead, I found myself drawn to a different idea. I'd fallen in love with the art world during this whole experience. The galleries, the auctions, the passionate collectors and dealers. It was like discovering a whole universe I'd never known existed. And I kept thinking about all the other lost or forgotten pieces that might be sitting in storage rooms, waiting to be discovered. So I made a decision that probably seemed crazy to most people. Instead of keeping all the money, I decided to use it to open my own gallery. Not a massive operation like David's, but a small, focused space that specialized in rediscovering forgotten or overlooked artists from the mid-20th century. I found a perfect space in Brooklyn, a converted warehouse in an up-and-coming neighborhood where the rent was still reasonable. It had great natural light, high ceilings, and enough room to display maybe 15 to 20 pieces at a time. Exactly what I was looking for. I called the gallery Second Chances, both because I was giving forgotten artists a second chance at recognition, and because I got my own second chance after being fired. It seemed fitting. The opening exhibition featured works by 5 different artists who'd been overlooked or misattributed over the years. I'd spent months researching and acquiring pieces, using the same investigative skills that had led me to the Twombly discovery. Nothing as valuable as that first piece, but each work had its own story of being lost and found. The art world loved the concept. Critics wrote about how I was filling an important niche, giving recognition to artists who'd been forgotten by history. Collectors started coming to me with pieces they'd inherited or discovered, hoping I could help identify and authenticate them. Within 6 months, Second Chances had become a respected name in the New York art scene. I was featured in Art in America magazine, invited to speak at conferences, consulted by other galleries and auction houses. The kid who'd been fired for asking too many questions had become a legitimate art dealer. But the best part was the work itself. Every day, I got to research artists, discover new pieces, help reunite lost works with the world. It was like being a detective, but instead of solving crimes, I was solving art history mysteries. I'd moved into a nice apartment in Brooklyn, bought a decent car, and was actually making a living doing something I loved. Not bad for a former security guard who'd gotten fired for being too curious. The only thing missing was closure with Richard. He had no idea what he'd thrown away, no idea that his disposal boxes had contained a multi-million-dollar artwork. As far as he knew, I'd just been fired for being a troublemaker, and that was the end of the story. But I had a feeling that was about to change. Word travels fast in the art world, and sooner or later, someone at the museum was going to figure out what had happened. When they did, Richard was going to have some very uncomfortable questions to answer. I just hoped I'd be there to see his face when he realized what he'd lost. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, about 8 months after the Sotheby's auction. I was at my gallery, preparing for a new exhibition about overlooked abstract expressionist works, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was unmistakably familiar. It was Richard, my former boss in the museum, the guy who'd fired me for asking too many questions. He sounded different though, nervous, almost sheepish. Gone was the arrogant tone I remembered so well. Instead, he was asking if he could come by the gallery to discuss something important. I have to admit, I was curious. I'd been expecting this call ever since the auction made news, but I'd figured it would come sooner. I told him he could stop by that afternoon, and spent the rest of the morning wondering what he wanted to discuss. Richard showed up at 2 p.m. sharp, looking older than I remembered. He was wearing the same cheap suit style, but his confidence was completely gone. He walked into my gallery like he was entering a church, cautious, respectful, maybe a little intimidated. The first thing he did was congratulate me on the gallery. He walked around, examining the pieces on display, nodding appreciatively at the wall text and the way everything was presented. It was clear he'd done his homework about what I'd been up to. Then he got to the point. He said he'd been following the story of the Twombly discovery, and he'd put 2 and 2 together. He knew the painting had come from the museum's disposal boxes, and he knew I'd been the one who'd tried to save it before getting fired. I didn't say anything. I just let him talk, watching him squirm as he tried to find a way to explain his actions. He said he'd been under pressure from the museum administration to clear out storage space, that he'd been dealing with budget cuts and staff reductions. He made it sound like firing me had been some kind of unfortunate necessity. But then he said something that really caught my attention. He told me that after the news broke about the auction, there had been a full investigation at the museum. The board of directors had demanded answers about how a multi-million-dollar artwork had ended up in disposal boxes. Turns out, the painting had been donated to the museum back in 1967 as part of a larger collection. It had been cataloged as unknown artist, abstract work, and stored in the basement. Over the years, as staff changed and records were lost, it had been forgotten. When the recent storage cleanup happened, nobody recognized its potential value. Richard explained that he'd been demoted as a result of the investigation. He was no longer in charge of security operations, and his salary had been cut significantly. The museum had also implemented new procedures for handling disposal items, requiring multiple expert reviews before anything could be discarded. I listened to all of this with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. On one hand, there was definitely some justice in seeing him face consequences for his arrogance. On the other hand, he looked genuinely defeated, like a man who'd realized he'd made a career-ending mistake. But then he surprised me. Instead of just apologizing and leaving, he made a proposal. He said the museum was looking for ways to rebuild their reputation after the scandal, and they were interested in partnering with galleries that specialize in discovering overlooked works. He suggested that my gallery might be interested in some kind of collaboration. Maybe we could work together to properly catalog and evaluate the museum's storage collections. Maybe we could partner on exhibitions that featured rediscovered or reattributed works. I had to give him credit. It was actually a smart idea. The museum had thousands of pieces in storage, many of them poorly documented or misattributed. With my eye for overlooked treasures and their institutional resources, we could probably find some amazing discoveries. But I wasn't about to make it easy for him. I told him I'd need to think about it, that any partnership would have to be on my terms. I said I'd only work with people who understood the value of curiosity and investigation, not those who discouraged it. Richard nodded eagerly, saying he understood completely. He admitted that he'd been wrong to dismiss my concerns, that he'd let his ego get in the way of doing what was best for the museum. He said he'd learned from the experience and would approach things differently in the future. We talked for another hour about the specifics of what a partnership might look like. I'd have access to museum storage areas, the ability to recommend pieces for further authentication, and input on exhibitions featuring rediscovered works. In return, the museum would get the benefit of my expertise and my connections in the art world. By the end of the conversation, we'd outlined a preliminary agreement. I'd start as a consultant, working part-time to help catalog and evaluate pieces in their collection. If things went well, we could explore a more formal partnership. But before he left, I wanted to make one thing absolutely clear. I looked him in the eye and said that I only worked with people who understood that art wasn't garbage, that every piece deserved respect and proper evaluation. I said that anyone who called curiosity a problem wasn't someone I could work with. Richard's face went red, and he nodded solemnly. He said he understood that he'd been wrong to treat me the way he had. He promised that things would be different this time, that he valued my expertise and my dedication to the art. After he left, I sat in my gallery for a long time, thinking about the strange turn my life had taken. A year ago, I'd been a part-time security guard getting fired for asking questions. Now I was a respected gallery owner being courted by the same institution that had dismissed me. The partnership ended up working out better than I'd expected. Over the next few months, we discovered 3 more significant pieces in the museum's collection. Not Twomey-level discoveries, but valuable works that had been misattributed or forgotten. Each find generated positive press for both the museum and my gallery. Richard kept his word about treating me with respect. He never questioned my methods or tried to limit my access to collection. If anything, he seemed grateful for the chance to redeem himself. He often mentioned how much he'd learned from working with me, how he'd come to appreciate the importance of thorough investigation. But I never forgot the lesson from our first encounter. In the art world, as in life, the people who discourage curiosity are usually the ones who have the most to lose when the truth comes out. Richard had tried to keep me from asking questions because he was afraid of what I might find. The irony is that if he'd just listened to me in the first place, the museum could have kept the Twombly piece and gained recognition for the discovery. Instead, his arrogance had cost him millions and nearly destroyed his career. Sometimes I wondered if he ever thought about that, if he ever calculated how much his pride had actually cost him, but I never asked. Some lessons are too painful to discuss, even after they've been learned. As for me, I was living proof that sometimes the best revenge is massive success. I'd gone from being dismissed as a know-nothing security guard to being recognized as one of the most promising young dealers in New York. And I'd done it all by refusing to stop asking questions. The gallery continued to thrive, and I kept discovering forgotten treasures. Some were worth thousands, others hundreds of thousands. None quite matched the value of that first Twombly piece. But each discovery reinforced my belief that there are masterpieces hiding everywhere, waiting for someone curious enough to find them. Every morning when I opened my gallery, I thought about that night in the museum basement, when I'd first seen those disposal boxes. If I'd just walked past them like I was supposed to, if I'd followed Richard's advice to stop thinking and just guard, I'd probably still be making $12 an hour and living paycheck to paycheck. Instead, I'd build a career based on the simple principle that everything deserves a second look. That curiosity isn't a problem to be solved. It's a superpower to be cultivated. And that sometimes the most valuable discoveries are hiding in the places where nobody thinks to look. Richard learned that lesson the hard way, but at least he learned it. And in the end, that made all the difference in whether we could work together. Because I only work with people who understand that art isn't garbage. And now, finally, he was one of them.